This session will be about an application study on Compliance Checker. I'm going to talk about what controlled substances are. We'll try to give you a definition of controlled substances. Then on the next part, I will tell you about what Compliance Checker is actually and how chemical definitions look like inside Compliance Checker. And then, of course, we move forward to the application study with some interesting findings and figures. It seems if you check the definition for controlled substances out there, that there are no elaborate definitions, there are no global definitions of this term. You can find description of controlled substances basically in every legal document that deals with these substances. So let's just read one. For an example, this is from the United States Code Controlled Substance Act, and it defines controlled substances as a drug or other substance or immediate precursor included in Schedule 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. So this is not very helpful. It doesn't tell us immediately anything about the structure or the scope of controlled substances. It only tells us that anything included in these documents are controlled. So let's try to look for another definition. This is from Wikipedia. I like this a little bit more because it's a little bit more general. A controlled substance is generally a drug or a chemical whose manufacture, possession, transport, or use is regulated by a government. So this immediately implies us that there's no such thing as global definition, but every government, every country defines the scope of controlled substances for themselves, more or less regardless of what's out there, what is the legal environment out there. So what is Compliance Checker? Compliance Checker is a web application for checking single or multiple molecules at a time and create reports on those molecules, whether they are controlled or not in a particular country. You can do this a compound at a time, but batch processing is also possible. In that case, of course, you receive a batch report. So it's quite convenient in that way. It has a seamless knowledge base update. This means that we are creating updates for all the countries covered, for the legislative documents in those countries to keep you updated and keep you up to date with the latest controlled substance legislations. It's possible to create custom category groups, which means if your company has a license for a particular controlled compound in a particular country, then you can create exceptions so that those compounds will not show up in a report, and you will only be able to focus on those which you have no license for. And Compliance Checker has several integration points to make it easy to incorporate into any research workflow. Currently, Compliance Checker has legislation for these 18 countries, and it also includes some international conventions and international agreements like United Nations conventions, European Union regulations, as well as these three documents. So how does a definition in Compliance Checker look like? In the legislative documents, most of the time, controlled substances are mentioned by name, and then there is some legal context to specify the circumstances under which the compound is controlled. Of course, this is not very searchable, so if we need, if we would like to search this chemical space, the controlled substance chemical space, we need better definitions. So we created definitions based on our Markush technology, and you can see an example here. This is from the United States Controlled Substance Act, and this is the structure of codeine, which is explicitly mentioned in Schedule 2. Interestingly, it is also mentioned in Schedule 3, which is a lower level of control, And instead of just mentioning codeine, Schedule 3 also specifies the circumstances of control, as I already mentioned. And what's important here is that it's not enough, it's not sufficient to just know that a controlled substance is mentioned in a legislative document. It's also important to know what's the legal context. And the great thing is that a compliance checker is actually providing this information as well, so you can immediately know under what circumstances the substance is controlled. Here is another example. This is from the United Kingdom's third generation Synthetic Cannabinoids Act. This law is a real beast, although the structure looks quite simple, but it's not simple, it's actually misleading because it has this very complicated definition. It covers a huge chemical space. And if we take a closer look, then it turns out that it actually includes some homology groups as well, which makes this space technically unenumerable. So it's an infinite chemical space in that sense. So now, after this short intro, I'd like to show you what we found during this application study. So a few run details. We chose the Campbell data set as our test set because it has lots of compounds of medicinal chemistry relevance. We run a compliance checker on 8 cores with 32 gigabytes of RAM. And so the Campbell, the test set, contained originally 1.7 million structures, of which we considered only 1.68 million. And the average runtime was 3.5 hours. There's an average runtime because we tested this set with different versions of the knowledge base. And of course, at earlier times, the knowledge base has different number of compounds, as we will see later, and therefore the runtimes varied a little bit. But on average, they were less than or about 3.5 hours, 3.5 hours. So here's the first summary of what we got. You see that 1.7 million was the original set, and only considered 1.68. We had to filter out a few those structures which are ambiguous or which are large molecules. And of the 1.68, we found 4%, about 62,000 controlled substances. So it's a significant number of controlled substances that you can find out there in this compound set. These were the compounds that were controlled by all countries, all 18 countries, plus by EU and United Nations regulations. But if you look at the structures more carefully, then it turns out that these are only 3 compounds, actually. The first one is the different stereoisomeric forms and salt forms of norephedrine, which is a decongestant. And then here we have an isotopically labeled LSD, as well as also isotopically labeled dimethoxymethamphetamine. Both are psychedelic drugs, so it's obvious why these are controlled in all countries. Okay. On this figure, we try to look at the data and the results from a different angle. So here you see all the number of controlled compounds per country. And this figure does not include the international conventions a country signed. So these are only those compounds that a country particularly regulates. And you also see these orange columns for each country. These depict the actual compounds that are specific to that country, so that are only controlled in that country. And the United Kingdom stands out from this scheme, as you see. It has over 35,000 compounds controlled only within the Campbell set. And many of those are controlled only by the UK. Belgium comes up next. It also has a much larger number of compounds controlled. Now, what is interesting here is that you all know that many of these countries, they are in the European Union, so one might think that they will more or less control the same scope of substances, but the case is not this, so that there are significant differences by country. And you probably not see it. There's a speck here. There's an orange, a thin orange line here, displaying that in the Netherlands there's one compound that is controlled only by the Netherlands. So what's this? If you take a closer look, this is a lysergic acid analog, and another lysergic acid analog. We know that well from one of the previous slides, that it's controlled in all countries, even though in the Campbell we can only find the isotopically labeled form. So why is that this compound is controlled in the Netherlands? It all goes back to a quite old law, a legal document from 1928, which defined this analog with this text and covered more compounds than just this one. So even though LSD is also specifically mentioned in the same document. So again, the context matters, because the context will define what are the actual compounds that the country controls. We also tested different versions of the knowledge base, as I said, and you can see clearly that the number of regulations as well as the number of controlled substances increase from year to year. And if you look at this, our example, the UK's third generation Synthetic Cannabinoids Act, then it adds up this much, these many compounds to the scope of controlled substances overall. Yet another figure, but this time based on the number of countries controlling a particular compound. So what you see here is at the left edge, those compounds, the number of those compounds which are specific to a particular country. So only one country controls this many compounds. This is a logarithmic scale. And at the other end, at the right end, you see those compounds which are controlled by all countries. We have a few hundred. And there seems to be a trend, even though I think this is a random trend, just probably looks like one. But what we can clearly state is that these compounds here are controlled only in 1/3 of the countries that we investigated the legislation for, and so therefore we can say that these are somewhat specific to those countries in terms of chemical control. And then the opposite, on the opposite side, you can say that these compounds are controlled by 2/3 of the countries, so these are more or less globally controlled. So these are the global controlled substances. And what is even more interesting is that the country-specific compounds cover 98% of the total controlled set of the Campbell database, and only 1% is globally controlled. This was my last meaningful figure, just an interesting idea at the end, or interesting use case. Here you see all the direct flights from San Diego to different countries. And so one could also use the same technique we used for checking those things, the number of controlled compounds and how they are distributed to countries. You can also create a figure like this, which tells you that, for example, if you consider signing an import-export agreement with a particular country, then which would be your best choice in terms of minimizing your number of licenses and paperwork, what is required. So clearly, in the US, you have like more or less 3.8 thousand compounds that are controlled. And if you start from here, you have some, of course, some requirement to create these documents. But if you wanna create that agreement with the UK, then that's probably not a good idea. You have a lot of other compounds to cover with your licenses. Like Brexit alone wouldn't be enough for them. And so you would probably choose Japan or Germany. I don't know. And I also have to tell you that these are not cargo flights. So these are just direct flights for passengers. So it's probably not a very good idea to try to export these controlled substances via these routes. But I assume that those people who try, they don't really care about paperwork anyway. So with this, I'd like to thank you.
How many times do they update the legislation to keep this up to date?
There are regular updates several times a year.
And how do we get it to them? How's this distributed?
So there are actually a couple of options. Probably the most convenient is automatic updates.
And do we host this as well, or is this on-premise for most of our end users?
So this is a hosted service, but on-premise is also possible.
There is an update server, so the on-premise installations can also check the new legislations and just download the latest one.
One more additional data to this one is that usually these updates came up well before the legislation it's taken into force. So actually it's like 2 weeks before that, at least, usually a few days after having it published in the according journal.